There's Edwin. Good.
We don't hear him.
Edwin, we don't hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. François will come on in 5 minutes. So please start with Alaa.
Sorry, so François is coming in 5 minutes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm quite disappointed that I haven't managed to be here in Utrecht with you. Alaa, perhaps you'd like to begin by introducing us a little bit to sort of reflecting a bit on the impulse that drove you to create this film and to think through the thematics that went into its making.
Yes, hello Edwin. And hello everyone, thank you for watching and staying all the way. So this film, or the genesis of this film, can be rooted in a research I've been invested in for many years now, and that is related to, let's say, the culture of death and the industrialization of death itself. And this film was born in a period of times in France where, I don't know if you've heard, maybe some of you have heard of the decapitation of a French professor, Samuel Paty. And so a very tense climate was dominating France at this moment, and sort of like unshy, I don't know how to say that, but like sort of a blunt racism was really all over the place, all over the TVs, and a true war against Islam was raised. So, so yeah, I mean, this film was has been brought up in that context. Mm.
And Alaa, we've had a lot of conversations around this film while it was being produced and thought through. And I was wondering, while you were making this film, you were in Marseille, so you were sort of immersed in the French context in a sense. And I was curious to know more about what were the sort of dominant images that were circulating at the time. Because we're talking about the post-Charlie Hebdo moment in France, wherein we've been, it's been established had reached its apex in some way. A state of exception was decreed in 2015 or 16, I think. Its sequels remained. One could feel it in the air. Were you reacting against certain hegemonic images that were circulating at the time? Or was it more of a distance, were you having critical distance while thinking through the conception of the film? Or was this also a visceral reaction against what you were seeing?
I feel that it's both, and especially me being or coming from Lebanon, so obviously being in France at this moment, I had to actually take some distance and look at what was going on, and also look at myself in this place and ask about also my reason to stay or be in France as an Arab, while I'm not feeling really the most welcomed, right? But I would say that there was really this, this atmosphere of like creating this, or let's say at least making people feel that there is like this permanent threat that was there all the time, and that people need to actually be aware of the Muslim community in France. And for me, it sounded like as if you know, somebody was trying to renier, to reject its own child, as if, you know, Muslims in France weren't French. You know, so yeah, I would say that it was a reaction to this, to these issues, and yeah, in a way for me also to take a distance. Yeah.
You say your film was born out of research that looked into cultures of death. You mention a lot this question of necrocapitalism, of necro-empowerment as well, of the industrialization of death in a sense. But through the film itself, we don't particularly see any scenes that point to hyperviolence in a way. There is more of the kind of images that are produced and disseminated so as to legitimize death, so as to create a manufacturing of sorts that can lead to the normalization of mass death. Could you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, violence isn't only visible. It's also something that is invisible and liquid in a way, like Zygmunt Bauman would have coined or would have said like this. I feel that there is violence as much in naming things and essentializing the other as much as in keeping the other in anonymity or silencing the other. Yeah, and also, I'm sorry, because I lost a bit your question, but I would try to continue. Yeah, it's also about the epistemological violence. This is what I wanted to say. So it's not only about the violence of the image or the image of violence itself, but also how within the image there is this epistemological violence that is embedded, and the production and circulation of those images itself that produces violence, and or at least normalize the violence. Yeah, and also I feel that this film is less about showing the violence than actually trying to go through the genealogy of this violence, and also the genealogy of the medium that make the violence seen. So the image, the camera. Yeah, so that's what I'd say.
But then a question to that, like you and François in that case, since you speak of this visual representation of violence, if one is to assume right at this stage that we know how colonial militaristic violence is wrought on also through the photographic apparatus, then what are we left with in terms of, you know, if we were to reproduce certain imagery, if we were to partake in image making, then how do we avoid the reproduction of this violence? And how can image making also serve as a way to counter the violence that, you know, colonial machinery tends to produce around certain territories, certain populations?
Well, I feel that first of all, the medium of the image, or let's even say the photographic medium in the origin, doesn't really show us the horror. But I even say that, I think Barthes said that, like, it introduces us to the scandal of horror and not horror itself. And I feel that we need to actually introduce people to horror in that sense, and to actually move far from the sensationalism of horror and the image of death. And I feel as well that we shouldn't be afraid of already confronting ourselves to these images. Many people, and also from the audiences, people ask me how could you actually watch, for instance, you know, Daesh propaganda, ISIS. And for me, it was really important to actually not only watch, but also archive this material for future purposes. So I feel that we must confront ourselves. We must not be afraid to actually put in conflict, or in that sense, to put in collision those images. And also, I think that it's a way, like, creating this violence is a way of disrupting our reality. So to disrupt violence, we need to also disrupt it, or disrupt the image that is the medium of violence in that context. So creating ruptures, irregularities, and yeah, counter visuality, I guess, yeah.
And speaking of counter-visuality, there's also something that I find fascinating about the film itself, is that beyond the image, there's also an interest in addressing the way in which data can create algorithmic biases that tend to also affect the material life of racialized populations and communities. In the film, you also toy with algorithmic tools in order to create, at a certain point, the image of an enemy, in a sense, as one would, as one would assume certain intelligence agencies or military formations within the Euro-American nexus to want to create. Could you speak more about the process that led to this, how it was produced?
So, as you may have noted, like really an important part of the film was co-created with the machine, and so artificial intelligence. And I came really to be interested in that medium, especially with the rise of the AI since, let's say, the past, or let's say not the rise, but the democratization of the AI since the last 5 years. And obviously I was also interested in, because so data is history today, right? So how could one actually, by collecting data, try to give birth to this universal enemy, or at least an enemy that everyone approves as such? So this fictive persona, right? And even though I could have actually shown this persona as the most close to reality, I've chosen, and especially the last part of the film, to actually abstract this persona. And I think it was a way for me also to confront the abstraction the West is undergoing, the West is doing, or the abstraction that the West does against minorities and what is considered the enemy. And what I did is I literally collected by hand thousands of images. So I entered keywords on Google and other search engines, and tags as such as terrorist, Arab, Muslim. And I just downloaded all the images, and I also picked images taken directly from Daesh propaganda, but I also included some of our world governors in the set. And so with the help of George Sims, we actually trained a model, so using an open source software, Runway ML. ML stands for machine learning. And so once we had collected all this data, we trained the model for a few days and came with this result. And this result is, and especially the last part, is quite interesting, because so what the machine does is that it creates this latent space. It's called a latent space. And within this space is like this, all the possibilities of the machine. So what you saw at the end is actually taken from this latent space, because there is no fixed result yet in what you've seen. So yeah, this is what I did, and it took a lot of time. It was really, yeah, it was really difficult, but worth trying. And also, what was really important for me is to try to counteract the machine in that sense. I don't know, I didn't want the machine to produce the ideal figure of the universal enemy. So, yeah. And just also to note that this term of universe, like the concept of universal enemy, I was inspired by a book that actually Edwin also introduced to me. The title is Universal Enemy by Darren Lee, pardon. And also, just entre parenthèses, because you spoke about that concept, gore capitalism. So gore capitalism is also at the core of my research. So gore capitalism is violence as seeing violence as a profitable labor, but also the commodification of death and the economy of death. So this also concept was coined by Sag Valencia, who is a Mexican professor, and her book is also titled Core Capitalism. So I invite you to read as well. Yeah.
I think something else that the Madman's Laughter does beautifully is also sort of go through not only archival material that one can link to the emergence of the ongoing war on terror, but also the different mediums through which that war has been mediated from the 90s onwards, right? In a sense, we're talking about archival material that was shot on camera, on early phones, disseminated through social media. Then there's also an attention that's drawn towards gamification and also the aesthetics of video game that played an incredible part in the US, particularly in manufacturing consent towards imperial conquest of certain territories, be it Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. Especially if one is to also remember that the US Army itself was producing video games in the early 2000s through its franchise America's Army. But then we also come to that part that you were just speaking of, right? Which is that of this machine learning driven as image making processes, and maybe it's I would even call this, and I know it's a word that you tend to use also a lot. It's this there's an archival archaeology that's at work in the film, in a sense. And maybe this question is a bit basic in principle, but I'd love to hear more also about how you've amassed all of this footage.
Yeah, I think François joined us, so hello, François.
Hi, François.
Hello, how are you doing? I made it.
So, yeah. So just to answer you, Edwin, regarding the collection of all this archival material, I'd just like to say one word before, is that it's also very important to keep in mind, whenever we look back into the history of perceptual technology, is how much it is rooted in actually the history of warfare, and even like the automatization of weapons is related to also like development of new cameras, etc. So it's really linked and intertwined, and also the fact that the image, this image of the archetypal image of the Arab, the enemy, the other, we can go back to literature, right? So the excerpts that were read by me in this film, some were written by Marco Polo, so we're talking about the 13th century, and they are so yeah. But this is a side note regarding the collection of archival material. Okay, so I have a feverish relation to archives, and quite obsessive about collecting images. I must confess. So. So there are many sources, mainly so on, let's say, start with the basics. On Google we can find many things, but also on official, let's say, government websites, like the Department of Defense, the American Department of Defense website, we have many archives that are there to download for free in very high res. So, and also this with me, I was a very, like, a question mark, why is this archive available online for anyone to actually download? It's an interesting question to ask. And also I used, let's say, unorthodox methods, because I had to delve into deep web and try to dig up archives that superpowers were trying to make disappear, like the archive you see at the beginning of the film. Even though it's not clear, but I can tell you that this archive, this footage is from the inside of Abu Ghraib prison, and what we're seeing are American soldiers torturing an Iraqi prisoner. And these footages, the Americans are trying to do the best they can to actually make them disappear from the web. So if you type Abu Ghraib video, you're not going to find the videos. You will find photos, stills, but... So, yeah, let's say these were my, my options. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alaa. François, I'll reverse to you now because we don't have much time left. So I was wondering whether I can slip in a question or two before our time is out. Can you hear me?
Please, Edwin, of course, go ahead.
Yeah, but I don't know if François is hearing me.
François, did you hear Edwin? François?
No, I didn't.
How come that François cannot hear Edwin? Can we solve it?
I hear you perfectly, but I didn't hear. There was a blank for a moment.
Okay, Edwin?
What about now?
Good, I hear you.
Okay, perfect.
So François, I wanted to essentially ask you now that we are in the midst of essentially coming close to 20 years since the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the arrival of the first detainees in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. I wanted to see how you tend to mediate and think through the film that you produced in 2002, how White Balance still manages to address certain questions that haven't been resolved, or how you feel things have changed for its engagement.
Well, I think they haven't changed, but I think that's basically what happens when you kind of try to... Am I being heard right now? Because I felt there was a change. Yeah, it came back. Am I being heard? Yeah.
Heard, yeah.
Okay. I think the question with these films is that when, or with these kinds of films that can withstand time, has to do with the fact that you really go to the archetypal, you really go deep into what's going on there. And many of the things that you were saying, and I'm missing your name because I've just landed from a plane. You who were speaking before me about Abu Ghraib, yes.
Oh, it's Edwin.
No, you. No, you who were speaking about hidden images, etc., having to go into the deep web.
So Alaa.
Not Edwin, but Alaa.
Yeah.
Alaa. Okay, Alaa. You were many of the things you were saying about the disappearance of images, about how that works and how that always works in more and more sophisticated ways, is a matter always. No, it's the matter of our contemporary situation. It was a matter 10, 20 years ago, and our hyper-contemporary situation always carries the same question of who is able to configure a reality that everybody buys quickly because of the lack of attention span, and therefore the world is reconfigured in front of the sleeping eyes of the civilization that cannot do anything about it. It just responds to a plan that is not exactly somebody's plan, but it's a plan, maybe of stupidity, the stupidity of greed and xenophobia, etc., has intrinsically manages the plan, and everybody's at the service of these feelings or these pulsions of domination and of control and of separation and of hiding and hiding what's truly being developed, what the true plan is in front of everybody's eyes. So if you go deep into any situation, it transpires that this is always the case. It's always the strategy, and it doesn't matter if it's the strategy by a group of people who are hidden behind trying to do it, or it's a strategy of the way language, a certain language that we've bought into is working. The language of war, for example. I was also thinking very closely about Virilio at the time, Paul Virilio, that you were kind of mentioning between the lines of how images work and how where the camera can point, the gun can point, and trying to shuffle all these kind of layers of unspeakability of how complex the situation is without falling into the immediate reaction, and therefore not presenting the broad range of an operation that is persistent and always more incisive and always more hidden. So that I would stay there. Thank you very much for your question, Edwin.
I think another question would also be, what I find striking about White Balance is also the fact that the film itself is entirely constructed through footage of the US, but of a US trying to look elsewhere, trying to target an elsewhere in a sense. And also through that is a soundtrack of different bureaucrats, government officials, warmongers, pundits, also trying to paint an expandable picture of an elsewhere that is attempting to threaten the US way of life. But then how did you manage through all of these all of this footage and that soundtrack accompanying it, you still managed to somehow pass along a certain subjectivity? There is an opposition to that image, and there's an opposition to that discourse that one can feel, but it is neither through the image nor through what is being said. How would you feel towards that?
Well, I did understand very quickly. Well, for one thing, my desire to make a film with the name White Balance, using the device that the camera has to adjust for whiteness, and to link that to racial politics, was already there before 9/11. So when 9/11 came, I was already working on this issue, but I didn't have a narrative to hold it, and therefore I was very ready, and I was in Manhattan, and I was going through all these places that you see in the video where I'm in Chinatown, and people are almost like in the Hercules animation selling already the souvenirs of the catastrophe that happened some blocks away. All these things were happening in front of my eyes, but I already thankfully had a grid for it, and so I could hold it. Also, I was recording radio and recording all kinds of things that were happening, because I knew that people, and there's so much more that I could bring out, because I knew that people were speaking in a way that would not, that they would not ever speak again in that same way. They were in the moment of trauma, and when I went on September 12th or September 13th to Union Square, and everybody was trying to understand, New Yorkers were speaking to each other, trying to understand what was going on, and saying, I'm an Arab American, I'm a Jew, and they were discussing between them and trying to come to terms with what had happened, like in the moment of trauma, and all other traumas were surfacing, and also on the radio, etc. The discourse was disorganized. So therefore, you could capture snippets of it that could reveal this whole ideology of us and them, etc., or of who is white, who has the power to give the narrative about the other, to objectify the other, and to, by objectifying the other, kill him or do without him if need be, you know, or create a system by which they will plunge into poverty. You know, that whole thing was evident because there were no filters. The sands had moved, the tectonic plates had moved, and therefore the discourse did not have the capacity of overwhelming, as it does normally, the mind by logics that are prefabricated in consensus reality. You know, I love the word consensus reality. You know, the fabrication of consensus reality was not that effective in that moment. Therefore, in this fast collage way, one could make these voices speak by themselves. To answer your question, to give the evidence of how it works, how that works. It was a moment of fracture. So the fracture being supremely important for any moment of truth. No, things were fractured.
And was there a particular type of, was there a particular targeting of the types of individuals that you were seeking to speak to on the streets following that?
Well, I thought the question of what does the American flag mean to you became, you know, I found that it was a very good device. And I went to, you know, a homeless man, and I went to a very white, almost brutal woman, you know, and I went to many people like this, and then I narrowed it down. But the question was a fundamental thing, you know, a device by which, again, the person would not fall into their usual rhetorics of, or appeased, and it would kind of break. It was a device, yeah, to make them speak, and I got quite good responses with that question in the streets of Soho, especially, you know, very close to Ground Zero. But I didn't target specific individuals. I just took a broad range. I think maybe there's only 2 or maybe 3 people who respond to the question in the film. There were longer versions, of course, as always.
No, it's particularly striking also that you speak of, I was not made aware that the white balance came through this question of racial politics and of whiteness itself. But it is a rather fascinating take that you present, also because of how much this notion of white rage has also become more popularized through the decades that followed 9/11. With the advent of Trump also, there's been a more focused sort of understanding of the way in which, you know, the psychic violence that comes out of whiteness tends to be reproduced through certain modes of entitlement, certain modes of, you know, performing nationalism that before, at the crux of the war on terror, was not particularly a very dominant mode of engaging with racial politics in the US.
Okay.
How would you speak to that now?
Well, I'd go back to the first question. You know, it's the point is, maybe the word archetypal is not so palatable, but I cannot think of another word right now. But it's just the fact that there are ways in which power operates, and they are universal. You know, they're incisive, and they're insidious, and they really create a language. And Bush had that language already. The world of George W. Bush had that language going on in a certain way. It was more linked to a faith. Something went wrong. Something went wrong for a moment. Okay.
We went into a phase.
But it's. I went to, okay, but now I'm back, right?
Yeah, just continue after we went into a phase. Then you can remember.
We went into a phase. Well, I was just saying that the faith-based administration of George W. Bush is a twin to Trump's you know, Gordon Gekko, greed, administration of America, but they're mostly the same. You know, the creation of the same kind of discourse. So I guess that's the reason why it resonates, because I dived deep into what was going on language-wise there, and therefore it was obvious that it's necessarily resonates with whatever else happens with the same intentions and the same mechanisms later, I guess.
Edwin, at this point, shall
Yes.
we involve the audience here and ask whether we have questions and comments here?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
So I ask you, I have the microphone. This one I need to turn on. Okay, but first, do we have a question, or you turn it on for me? Anybody to join the discussion? Okay, then maybe I do, and I would, Alaa, I mean, no, it's fascinating how you talk about your work and to learn about all these processes. But one thing you haven't touched on yet is your film is not only about images, it's equally about sound. So how did that come about? And especially in the end, with this sort of repetition exercise or accumulation of power to power relation, is that a poem in itself? So how you constructed the sound on the textual level, but also on the sort of
Narrative or
narrative, but also this sort of data sonification.
Exactly.
Exactly.
That was
so I think that also reproduces what you do with the images. So,
exactly, and that was the process. So I worked with Hamad Safa, who's a musician, sound designer from Lebanon, and he exactly did that. He let's say turned images into sounds using AI tools, and it was important for me, I think, to also try to maybe in a symbolic way, let's say, to look into what is behind the image, the sound of the image, let's say. The sound of war, the sound of conflict, the sound of violence. And also regarding the text itself, and I left it ambiguous on purpose. So sometimes I actually say to the audience that the AI is telling me and is telling us things, and it actually does. I ask the AI, and I would, for instance, introduce the text by a word, terrorism, and the machine would do the rest, right? So let's say the part where it speaks about terrorism is great. It's the AI machine that said that, not me. And the last part in the film as well. So it's a part that was said by the AI itself. But some other parts, I left it unknown. So I think for me it was a way also to... I feel that we have become also, or the machine has become an extension of ourselves and of also our, and is also today thinking for ourselves and looking for ourselves, and also capable today of actually generating or self-generating images for itself. So yeah, I think I tried to really tackle this matter also through sound. Yep.
Do we have a question now or comment from your side? Yes. You have to speak through the microphone.
I was wondering, do you also archive sound in the same way as you do it with pictures?
I archive mostly images, but I also archive sounds. I mean, when it comes to videos, it's some of them are also with audio, right? So systematically I'm archiving sounds, but mainly images, but definitely audio recordings as well. Yeah.
Just a little bit out of curiosity, do you know if similar archives, as you mentioned before, exist in terms of field recordings?
In terms of field recordings?
Yeah.
What kind of archives? I didn't understand.
Like you mentioned before, like accessible governmental archives.
Field recordings. I mean, you were talking about like raw archives, right? Like some, yeah. Maybe try on archive.org. It's it's a hint. Yeah. I'm not sure about intelligence websites with that. Yeah.
Edwin, something more on your list? I would have another question for François, but maybe you have something on your list, Edwin?
I'm good. Maybe you can go ahead and ask your question to François.
Okay, François, also about the form of your film, and I'm time and again when I see white balance, and we screened it in 2002, even here at IMPAKT 20 years ago. So
True.
It's amazing, and I couldn't help to pull it out of the archive, so to say. And but what puzzles me time and again, and I think at that time I was completely unaware of that, and we are very used to now have lots of artistic videos using desktop recording, right? How you just record, how you zap through the internet and so forth. And you were so extremely early with that, and it's amazing to see this QuickTime Player windows and, well, I don't know, Photoshop 1.2 probably, and so on. How did you come about in that moment to exactly do the film this way, and to formulate a method of collage in there in exactly that way, and utilize this source materials you had at hand at that time?
Well, Florian, first of all, I would like to say it right now that I am extremely grateful that you have kept on showing this piece, because otherwise it would have been forgotten, and that's you know, the beautiful ministry of the curator. It's a beautiful ministry. Otherwise, the film would not speak anymore. And here with Alaa, I immediately now I just read your name. So very sorry. I see the resonances 20 years in between, and basically, I think that the question was urgency. I mean, I felt urgency, and everything came from saying, okay, what do you do? What do you do in front of something when meaning is happening so fast in front of your eyes? And so I invented the form. I didn't know that others were inventing it at the same time, or that I was before time, you know, doing desktop recordings and this kind of things. It was just the device I understood and I found at hand, try to speak fast, because I thought, this is urgent. I need to speak now. I have something to say. That was the reason. And one thing I was seeing in relationship with Alaa's, what she was saying is that, you know, the question, the form is very important as well, because the form is poetry. Poetry is the form that will work through time, because poetry leaves the container open. It doesn't narrow down. It doesn't seek to be information. It's exactly resisting information. And it's saying, I will create a container for meaning in a way that the late Godard said it once, you know, when somebody asked him, what do you mean exactly? And he said, I mean, but not exactly. And that's the point of this question, you know, to create something that is between meaning and rhythm. So it skids between the two of them. It's not rhythm, it's not meaning, and that's where something else, which is atemporal. I mean, what's the word in English? Not bound by time. I forgot how you say that in English. Atemporal, non-temporal, or ultra-temporal. That's where it happens, no? That's where it takes place, because you opened up a place that the spectator or the film viewer will fill. It's not information. It's not you know, the kind of discourse where you are exacerbating. Frozen. I can see my frozen image, but I guess my sound keeps going.
We hear you again.
Okay, you hear me again. The intention of going deep needs to be carried by a certain language that doesn't narrow, I guess. So but that was not your question. I went into other questions. Anyway, the question about how these devices were invented, there was no reference, but it was the moment when it happened to a lot of us, that we understood that the material was there. You know, we could just go for it because it was streaming online. It was very new streaming in that moment. One of the things that happened that relates to the first question that you were answering when I arrived, Alaa, was that I also had this moment when Warner Brothers was releasing this film on Colombia, where I come from, where Arnold Schwarzenegger goes and takes revenge on his son being killed, and reality spoke to Warner Brothers and said, you overstepped here because you're making a spectacle of something that actually happened. So they withdrew it the next day, and I was fast enough to grab it before they withdrew it. This fall, the war hits home, and all of a sudden that becomes porn, because it's always porn, but it's just porn that it cannot be sanctioned as porn by anybody, because spectacle, that's what it does to us. You know, it's all the time ravaging us, you know, like a wave. It passes on top of us. And in this case, just the juxtaposition of the reality that had happened in New York with what the way they were promoting their film, to excite you, you know, to go to the movie theaters. It became impossible. So they had to write that letter that I have a screen grab of that letter, where they say that after these events, we respectfully for the victims cannot show this. All of a sudden, you know, victims. I mean, all of a sudden they cared a lot when they didn't care about all these deaths around the world, but now it was home, you know. So that whole thing was what was moving me, because I come from a country that has gone through, well, a tremendous amounts of deaths based on absurd wars, like the war on drugs that our current president is finally addressing in the UN and everything. He's saying this has been a travesty. This is absurd, and it's always been absurd, and we've been playing this absurd game that kills billions of people all the time because of an invented action.
And largely unnoticed. It's really hard to break that up here. We have it very late. We run almost to midnight. I think I'm really moved, because I think it's an incredibly interesting questions and answers after a screening, and we managed to do it so truly hybrid in here and connect Berlin, Utrecht, and Mexico, Ciudad de Mexico. So
Mérida.
Where are you?
Mérida. I just landed in Mérida, Yucatan.
Ah, okay, but in Mexico. Edwin, thanks a lot for joining us with your great questions.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks everybody. It was really amazing, and it's really an amazing end to an intense festival day here. We continue tomorrow. And so
Can I just say something to François? That I was really, really happy to be introduced to your work, really. I didn't know. I watched White Balance when Florian told me about the film program, that my film was going to screen with yours. And I said to myself that my film has found a brother
I heard it when you were speaking.
A big
yeah.
brother.
So they should be screened more in the
No, thank
future.
Well,
together.
yeah, thank you very much for saying that, Alaa, and I want to see your film as well. I have had a very hectic time, and thank you again very much, Edwin, and very much Florian for always making these hyper sutures. These are beautiful.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. You're amazing. And we see each other tomorrow. And have a good day, night, and goodbye. Thank you, guys and girls. Good night.
Bye bye.